The following Appalachian Mountains horror story is real, disturbing, and should be used as a warning. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. Something was wrong with the woman Betty met on the trail. She just couldn't figure out what it was. Not until 2 in the morning on the second night, when a smell crept in under her tent door, and her brain finally caught up with what her gut had been screaming at her for 2 days straight. Betty Callahan had been to Tishomingo State Park so many times she stopped counting somewhere around her 30th birthday. The park sits in the far northeastern corner of Mississippi, right where the Tennessee River has been grinding into ancient rock for so long the ridges feel older than they have any right to. We're not talking Smoky Mountains famous, no gift shops, no overlook parking lots packed bumper to bumper with minivans. Just hard. Folded country with hollows so deep they don't show up on the trail maps. The kind of place that keeps its own business. Betty grew up 20 minutes east in Yucca. Her father had her on these trails before she could read a compass. She knew every mood this terrain had, the way the hollows smelled after a hard rain, the way the ridgelines looked in low winter light, the specific sound the creek made when it was running too fast to trust. This was not a place she visited. This was a place she came from. She was 55 years old, and she had just retired after 28 years as a school nurse. No party. No plaque. No one even brought a grocery store cake. She cleaned out her locker on a Thursday afternoon, carried a single cardboard box to her car, drove home, and sat in her kitchen for 3 days straight, while the silence pressed against the walls like something living. The hike wasn't a vacation. She wasn't celebrating anything. She just needed to get somewhere quiet enough that the question forming in the back of her skull might finally find its shape. The question was something like, what does a life look like when the thing that always organized it is gone? She hadn't figured out the words for it yet, but she figured the mountain might help. The timing was good or good enough. The day before, Tishomingo County had been sitting under a flash flood warning, hard rain, creek banks jumping, the forest floor soaked down past where roots could drink it. But the forecast had cleared overnight. 3 clean days ahead, temps in the low 60s. Betty had checked it twice before she left the house. The trailhead parking lot was empty when she pulled in. Gravel popping under her tires, engine ticking cool in the quiet. She shouldered her pack. The trail opened in front of her through a stand of bare hardwoods, the ground soft and dark from 2 days of rain, everything smelling like wet bark and cold mud and that particular stillness that follows a hard storm, like the woods were exhaling. She walked. 6 miles in, trail loose and finally quiet in her own head, she stepped off the path to let 2 hikers pass. Old courtesy. Her father had drilled it in before she was 10. You step aside, you nod, you let people move. The 2 hikers stopped. The woman was 33 maybe, tall. A quick smile that arrived just a half second ahead of the rest of her face, the kind of smile that was practiced enough to look easy. She said her name was Isabella. The girl standing slightly behind her was 13, both arms crossed low over her stomach despite the warmth of the afternoon, sleeves pulled down past her wrists. Isabella said the girl's name was Rainey. They were easy company, genuinely. Isabella was funny in that dry, unpracticed way of someone who didn't perform for people. She just said what she thought and let it land. Rainey said almost nothing, and Betty filed that under teenager and moved on. Isabella was planning 5 days in. Betty was planning 3. Then let's do 3 together, Isabella said. Just like that. Like the math was obvious. Betty agreed. They made camp together that first night, fire going, freeze-dried meals. Isabella telling a story about a wrong turn in the Bankhead Forest that lasted 45 minutes and ended with a gas station owner who didn't believe in roads. Betty laughed for the first time in 11 days. She didn't count the days until later. Somewhere between the fire and the dark, she caught herself watching Rainey. The girl sat just outside the firelight. Still, arms still crossed, sleeves still down despite sitting 3 feet from an open fire in 60-degree air. Betty watched her with the specific attention of someone who had spent 28 years noticing things children were hoping adults would miss. Earlier, when they'd shaken hands at the trail, Rainey had used her left. The right stayed pressed flat against her thigh the entire time. Betty turned back to the fire. Isabella was still talking. The woods sat dark and close on every side. Why the left hand? Day 1 moved well. Good miles, good light. The trail followed Bear Creek for most of the morning, the water still running fast and brown from the flood runoff, pushing hard against the rocks like it had somewhere to be. Isabella walked point, identifying edible plants along the bank the way some people narrate sports. Steady, easy, like she couldn't help it. Chickweed, henbit, a cluster of ramps pushing up through the leaf litter near the water's edge. Rainey walked between them and said nothing, in a way that had started to feel less like shyness and more like discipline. Like quiet was something she had practiced until it became a habit she couldn't turn off. Betty filed that away. No label for it yet. The creek crossing came mid-afternoon. The water was thigh-high and cold enough to ache. Betty felt it through her waterproof gaiters like a hand closing around her legs. Rainey went across second, picking her way carefully over the submerged rocks, one hand out for balance. Halfway across her pack clasp caught her sleeve and pulled it up past the elbow. Betty saw it in one glance. Neat horizontal marks lined the inside of Rainey's right forearm. Old ones gone flat and silver. New ones still carrying that specific pink at the edges that meant recent. Too even for bramble scratches. Too deliberate for anything accidental. Betty's eye read them the way 28 years of school nursing had trained it to, not with alarm, with inventory. She noted the spacing. She noted the pattern. She noted the way Rainey's jaw tightened as she tugged the sleeve back down without looking up from the current. Betty looked away first. 6 feet upstream, Isabella was crouched at the bank filling her water bottle, filter pressed to the mouth, not looking at either of them. Betty helped Rainey find her footing on the far bank and said nothing and kept walking. So she watched Isabella more carefully the rest of the afternoon. She watched the way Isabella touched Rainey's shoulder when the trail narrowed. She watched the way she handed the girl food at the rest stop, checked her boots at the second creek crossing, pointed out a red-tailed hawk riding thermals above the eastern ridge, and waited to see if Rainey would look up. Rainey looked up, for just a second, almost a smile. Isabella was warm, competent, present, attentive in the specific, unhurried way of a mother who had been paying attention for 13 years, which made the arm worse, not better. Not easier to explain, just worse. Night 1. The temperature had settled into the low 40s by the time they got the fire down to coals. Betty zipped her tent at 9:30 and was asleep by 10, the creek noise folding over her like a second blanket. The sound pulled her up at 2 in the morning. Click. She lay still and listened. Click, click. It was a lighter, a Bic. The specific dry plastic snap of the striker wheel turning without catching, then going out. Over and over, patient and rhythmic, threading through the tent fabric and the dark and the creek noise, like it was looking for something. Betty unzipped the door 1 inch. Isabella sat cross-legged at the dead fire ring maybe 15 feet away. She had the lighter in her right hand and her left palm open and held 2 inches above the flame each time it caught. Not testing the heat, not warming her fingers, just holding her hand above it, watching. Her face carried the specific expression of someone who genuinely believed they were completely alone in the world right then, somewhere else entirely. The flame went out. She clicked it again. On, off, on, off. Betty pulled the zipper back down without a sound. Rainey's voice came from directly behind her, flat, awake. No surprise in it at all, like she'd been sitting up in the dark waiting for exactly this moment. She does that a lot. Then silence. Betty lay back down on top of her sleeping bag, with her boots still on, and stared at the tent ceiling, and listened to the creak and the lighter, and the wet breathing of the woods around them. She did not sleep again. Rainey knew it was happening without a single look outside. She didn't check. She didn't ask. She just knew. The way you know a sound when you've been listening for it in the dark long enough that your body learns to wake up before your brain does. How many nights had she spent listening for that exact sound? Day 2 was good enough to make Betty doubt herself. Real coffee from Isabella's French press passed around in the cold morning air while the fog sat low in the hollow below camp. A red-shouldered hawk riding thermals above the ridge. Rainey almost, smiling at a joke Betty made about her ancient rain jacket, the one with the duct tape patch on the left elbow that had been there since 2009. Isabella laughed out loud at that one. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised even her. Betty thought, I was reading into things. I've been alone too long. I'm inventing problems where there aren't any. The arm could be old. The lighter could be a nervous habit. Plenty of people have nervous habits. She believed it enough to relax her shoulders for the first time in 18 hours. She believed it enough to stop watching Isabella's hands. So she let herself enjoy the morning. The miles came easy. Isabella found a cluster of ramps along the creek bank and tucked a handful into her pack for dinner. Rainey walked point for a stretch, setting a pace that was quietly impressive for someone her size on wet terrain. Betty matched it without complaint and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since Thursday. But at the second campsite Betty found them, she almost missed them entirely. She was clearing ground for her tent, dragging her boot through the leaf litter to check for roots, when she felt the first one, a low, hardened depression in the soil, maybe 2 feet across, the ground inside it scorched down to bare mineral earth. She stopped, looked, moved 6 feet northeast and found the second one, moved 8 feet west-southwest and found the third. 3 burn sites, ground level. Deliberately low. Not a campfire, nothing built up with rocks or logs. Just accelerant poured directly onto the earth and lit and left to spread until something stopped it. Arranged in a loose triangle maybe 20 feet across, set back just off the established fire ring like whoever made them didn't want them found by someone looking in the obvious place. Old burns, cold. The rain 2 days prior had washed most of the ash into the soil, but not all of it. Betty crouched over the nearest one for a long moment. Her knee ached from the miles. The woods sat quiet around her, that particular late afternoon quiet when the light goes amber and the birds stop moving, and everything seems to slow down and hold its breath. She took her phone out and photographed all 3, said nothing, tucked the phone back in her hip pocket and walked back to camp and helped Isabella string the bear hang like absolutely nothing had happened. Night 2 came in cold. The temperature had been dropping since sundown, slowly at first, then with purpose, a cold front sliding down from Tennessee the way it does in early Mississippi spring when the weather changes its mind overnight without apologizing. Betty had felt it coming all afternoon, in the way the air shifted, the particular pressure of it, the way sound started to carry differently through the trees. She zipped her sleeping bag to her chin and fell asleep listening to the creak. The zipper woke her. Not her zipper, the tent door zipper, opening from outside. Rainey slipped in through the gap, moving fast and low and completely silent, the practiced economy of someone who had done this exact thing before. She pressed her back against the tent wall the moment she was inside, pulled her knees to her chest, made herself small in the small space the way a person does when they've had reason to learn how. Her finger went straight to her lips. Her eyes were wide and completely dry. Betty sat up. Rainey shook her head once, sharp, the single decisive motion of someone who had rehearsed this, who had a system, who needed the system followed exactly right now. And the finger stayed hard against her lips. Betty stayed still. Outside, silence. The creek was still running. The wind was still moving through the upper canopy. But underneath all of it, underneath the normal sounds, there was a different kind of quiet pressing in close to the tent. The kind that had weight to it. The kind that meant the small animals had stopped moving. Then it came in under the door, low to the ground, threading through the tent fabric and the cold air and the smell of mud and wet bark. Betty's nose found it before her brain did, her body going rigid and her lungs locking up in the half-second before recognition landed. She knew that smell. 28 years as a school nurse, 2 kitchen fires, 1 boiler room explosion, a shop class incident in 2011, she still couldn't describe at dinner parties without her hands going cold. Gasoline, not a splash, not a spill. A pour. Heavy and deliberate and thorough, the kind of saturation that soaks down through leaf litter and into the soil and the base of the trees and the root systems underneath. The kind engineered to catch hard and hold and spread outward in every direction at once. The ridge above the tent glowed dull orange through the nylon. Betty understood it all at once, not as a thought arriving in sequence, but as a single physical fact dropping into her chest like a stone into still water. Isabella had not started a campfire that got away from her. Isabella had not been careless. Isabella had carried gasoline into the Tishomingo backcountry in a pack on her back. And she had walked a deliberate quarter-mile radius in the dark. And she had poured it, and she had lit it, and she had meant for it to go. The 3 burn sites in the triangle. The lighter at the dead fire ring at 2 in the morning. The specific patience of someone working towards something they had been planning for longer than Betty had known her name. Rainey's hand closed around Betty's wrist. Hard. Move. The gasoline doesn't end up in a hiking pack by accident. Isabella carried it in on her back, and she knew exactly where to pour it. How long had she been planning this specific fire, in this specific place? Betty grabbed Rainey's wrist and they went. No discussion, no plan beyond up and away. They gained ground fast in the first 60 seconds. Crashing through the dark timber above camp with Betty's headlamp, cutting a thin white tunnel through the black. Branches, wet leaves, the ground uneven and treacherous under a full layer of flood-soaked leaf litter that hid everything underneath it. Roots, rocks, rotted wood, the edges of things. Betty didn't slow down. But Isabella stepped onto the trail directly ahead of them. She didn't lunge. She didn't run at them. She simply appeared. Standing in the middle of the path, maybe 30 feet out, lighter in her right hand, facing back toward the fire with the calm and focused stillness of someone watching their own work catch. The orange light from the ridge moved across her face in slow pulses. She wasn't looking at them yet. 1 second. 2. So Betty wrenched them hard left into the dark timber without breaking stride, pulling Rainey by the wrist off the trail and into the trees, angling up the slope away from the fire and away from Isabella and away from everything that had a name. But Rainey's boot punched straight through a rotted log hidden under the leaf litter. The wood gave way with a soft, wet crack, and the girl went down hard, full weight, no warning. Betty caught her with her left arm and felt her own knee wrench sideways in the same motion. A bright, specific pain that fired up through her hip and then went quiet. In the way that meant it would be loud again later when the adrenaline finished its job. They were slower now. Nothing to do about that. The rhododendron came at them like it had opinions. Branches clawed Betty's face and grabbed at her pack straps and found every gap between her collar and her jaw. Her shoulder hit a tree trunk she didn't see coming, and the whole left arm went numb from the impact. Not painful yet, just absent. The arm swinging at her side, doing what she told it without sending back any information. She cataloged that and kept moving. The ridge dropped away to her left. She felt it before she saw it. The air going suddenly cold and empty beside her the way it does above a long drop. The specific absence of ground that her body understood before her eyes caught up. The headlamp swept left and found nothing. Just dark and distance and the sound of the creek far below, running fast and indifferent. She did not look down. She knew this terrain. Her father had walked her through hollows like this one in the dark, on purpose, when she was 9 years old. No flashlight, just his hand and his voice and the ground under her feet. Trust the ground, he had told her. It knows where it is even when you don't. She trusted it now. She moved right, staying parallel to the drop, letting her boots read the slope, and the ground told her everything she needed. Behind them, the fire was already behaving wrong. It caught. She could hear it, the soft roar of ignition climbing the ridge above camp. And then it crawled. The saturated earth from 2 days of flooding drank the edges before they could spread, pulling the fire down and inward instead of letting it run. The trees in this stretch of Tishomingo backcountry ran wide-spaced, hardwoods planted far enough apart that the canopy never quite closed, nothing close enough for the fire to leap between, nothing to carry it laterally the way Isabella needed it to go. The cold front, that had been sliding down from Tennessee since sundown, pressed the flames flat against the wet ground. The fire moved maybe 30 feet northeast, stalled. The edges hissed against the soaked soil and began to die back on their own, slowly, grudgingly, like something that knew it had been cheated. Half a mile out on the service road, a ranger on overnight patrol caught the accelerant smell through his open window, pulled over, and called it in before his crew even geared up. By the time suppressant arrived, the fire was mostly a black half-acre scar steaming quietly in the cold. Looking nothing like what Isabella had carried a full can of gasoline on her back for 3 days to create. Betty didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the sound behind them had shifted from roaring to hissing. And that hissing, that small, defeated, wet hissing, sounded improbably, impossibly like survival. Bear Creek found them before they found it. The sound came up through the trees first, loud and close and real, the creek running fast and high from the flood runoff, completely indifferent to everything that had happened on the bank above it. Betty pulled Rainey down the last slope toward the sound, and her communicator found signal the moment they cleared the tree line. 1 bar. Enough. She transmitted. Her voice came out flat and steady, the same register she had used for 28 years to tell parents things she did not want to say. She gave their location by landmark and approximate trail distance. She gave 2 names. She said arson and accelerant and child in that order, because that was the order that mattered. The voice on the other end said, "Stay where you are." Betty pulled Rainey against her side, and they sat down together on the wet rock above the creek. The girl's breathing was fast but controlled. Not panic, just effort, the lungs doing their job. Betty's knee had started talking again now that they'd stopped moving. She noted it and ignored it. The woods above them were quiet. The hissing had stopped. She looked back toward the tree line. Isabella's silhouette stood at the edge of the timber, still, watching, the lighter no longer visible in her hand. The orange light from the ridge had faded to almost nothing. Just the dark and the cold and the creek, and the two of them sitting on the rock above the water. Betty looked at the tree line for a long moment. When she looked again, the silhouette was gone. She did not see Isabella move, did not hear a footstep or a branch or any sound of departure at all. One moment the shape was there. The next moment the tree line was just trees. Betty did not go to look. She kept Rainey against her side and watched the water and waited for the lights. 3 days later, she dropped her keys in a parking lot outside a Walgreens in Yucca and sat down on the asphalt and didn't get up for a while. A woman coming out of the store asked if she needed help. Betty said she was fine. She wasn't fine yet, but she would be. The fire investigator confirmed it the following week. The gasoline saturation covered a deliberate quarter-mile radius, placed in a pattern consistent with someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done the planning long before they ever set foot on the trail. This was not impulse. This was not accident. What was Isabella trying to burn badly enough to carry all of that in on her back? Search and rescue pulled them out at first light. 4 rangers and a paramedic, moving fast up the service trail with headlamps still burning even though the sky had gone gray enough to see by. Betty heard them before she saw them. Boots on gravel, the crackle of a radio, someone calling her name through the trees. She called back once. They found them on the creek bank exactly where she'd said they'd be, sitting on the same wet rock. Rainey still tucked against Betty's side with the silver emergency blanket. One of the rangers had radioed ahead to leave at the trailhead, wrapped around both of them. Rainey stood up on her own, walked out on her own, didn't take anyone's hand. Betty noted that and said nothing. The fire was already cold by the time they reached the ranger station, killed by wet ground and cold air, and the indifferent spacing of the trees, 3 factors that had nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with the specific misfortune of Isabella choosing Tishomingo in the wrong week. The flash flood warning Betty had checked twice before leaving the house. The cold front she had felt coming all afternoon in the way the air shifted. The wide-spaced hardwoods her father had walked her through in the dark 45 years ago, so she would know what her feet were telling her. None of it was planned. All of it held. Investigators reached the origin point before noon. Accelerant confirmed. Pour pattern consistent with deliberate placement across a wide radius. Not one person moving carelessly, but one person moving methodically, covering ground with purpose, taking their time. The rangers found 3 previous burn sites within 2 miles of camp before lunch, ground level, cold, arranged in the same loose triangle Betty had photographed the day before. The photograph was already on the investigator's phone by 9 in the morning. It had always mattered. She just hadn't known yet what it mattered for. The case opened as aggravated arson before the end of the day. The missing persons file opened beside it before the end of the week. Both files stayed open. Neither one moved toward anything that looked like closure. Isabella's car sat in the trailhead parking lot for 11 days before it was towed. Authorities found a change of clothes in the trunk, a road atlas with 3 pages dog-eared, and a receipt from a gas station in Corinth dated the morning of the hike. The receipt was for $42 of regular unleaded and a bottle of water. The atlas pages. Betty thought about those for a long time afterward, the specific patience of someone who had looked at maps. Isabella was never found. Not in the fire scar, not in the woods, not on any road leading out of Tishomingo County. The file used the word presumed in 2 places and unknown in 4. Nobody closed it. At the ranger station, Rainey sat in a silver emergency blanket and stared at the tree line through the window. Betty sat beside her. The room smelled like bad coffee and wet gear, and the particular institutional warmth of a building that runs its heat too high. Someone had left a box of granola bars on the table. Neither of them touched it. Neither of them said anything useful for a long time. Eventually, Rainey picked up a cup of coffee, took 1 sip, and set it back down on the table without looking at it again. She kept her eyes on the tree line through the window. The dark edge of the timber sitting quiet and ordinary in the gray morning light, looking like nothing at all had happened in it 8 hours ago. Without turning her head, she said, "She always let me know first." That was all. Betty did not ask her to explain it. She didn't need to. She understood exactly what it meant, that this was not the first time Rainey had slipped into someone's tent in the dark with her finger pressed to her lips. That the girl had a system. That the system had a history behind it long enough that it had become reflex. That she had spent enough nights listening for the click of a lighter in the dark that her body had learned to wake up before the sound was even fully real. The system worked. It had worked before. It worked again last night. Betty reached over and put her hand on top of Rainey's and left it there. Rainey didn't pull away. Betty drove home 4 days later with a wrapped knee and a referral to an orthopedic specialist and a card from the lead investigator with his direct number written on the back in ballpoint pen. She pulled into her driveway on a Tuesday afternoon, turned the engine off, sat in the silence of her own car in front of her own house, and looked at the kitchen window and thought about the 3 days she had spent sitting in there after cleaning out her locker. The particular weight of a silence that had nothing behind it. This silence was different. She had come out here to find out what her life looked like without the thing that had always defined it. She had her answer now. It looked like this: a wrecked knee, a 13-year-old girl she had carried out of a burning forest, and the cold specific knowledge that when it mattered, she had not stopped, and she had not frozen, and she had not let go of that wrist for a single second. That was enough. That was more than enough. She got out of the car and went inside and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table in the quiet, and let the quiet be what it was. Tishomingo holds its secrets the way old ground does, in the soil, in the char, in the creek that runs cold and indifferent past whatever happens on the bank above it. The investigators will tell you the fire stayed small because of the weather and the moisture and the spacing of the trees, and they are right. The science is clean, and it checks out, and there is nothing mysterious about wet ground killing a fire before it runs. But Betty Callahan will tell you something slightly different if you ask her at the right moment, in the right quiet. She will tell you the mountain was already soaked when Isabella struck the lighter. She will tell you the forest was already spaced the way it needed to be. She will tell you the cold front arrived exactly when it had to. She will tell you she grew up knowing this terrain well enough to trust her feet in the dark, that her father taught her that in these specific woods, that she had 45 years of muscle memory in this exact ground working in her favor. She does not say any of this as comfort. She says it as fact, as inventory, the same flat register she uses for things that simply are what they are. The mountain was ready before any of them arrived. That is what she will tell you. She does not mean it as reassurance. She means it as a warning. 14 months after the incident, the Tishomingo County Sheriff's Office received an interagency inquiry from investigators in Harlan County, Kentucky. Backcountry fire. Accelerant confirmed. Origin point consistent with deliberate placement across a wide radius. A woman matching Isabella's physical description had been reported at the trailhead by 2 separate hikers in the 48 hours prior to the fire. No arrest, no confirmation, no name attached to anything yet. The inquiry was logged, cross-referenced with the open missing persons file, and forwarded to the state fire marshal's office. Betty received a courtesy call from the original investigator on a Wednesday morning while she was making breakfast. He walked her through the Kentucky inquiry in 4 sentences, asked if she had anything to add. She told him what she knew, which was the same thing she had known since the moment she photographed those 3 burn sites in the triangle. That whatever Isabella was looking for out there in the backcountry, she hadn't found it yet. He thanked her. She hung up. She stood at her kitchen counter for a long moment with the phone in her hand and the eggs going cold in the pan. Then she thought about Rainey, about a 13-year-old girl who had a system, who had always been let know first, who had walked out of those woods on her own 2 feet without taking anyone's hand. Betty hoped she was somewhere the lighter couldn't find her. She turned the burner back on and finished making breakfast. The eggs were fine. For more Appalachian Mountains horror stories, click here. I'm the Shadow Teller. Stay safe in the dark.